pause it? What am I doing? No, I don't want to cancel. All right, so I guess we were recording and I didn't turn it off. All right, are you ready?
Yep, go for it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Bookstore Romance Day. And incorporating into that, we have, I don't think I'd call it a romantic mystery, but nonetheless, a fabulous book set in 18th century London. And Elsa Hart, who has previously brought us 3 perfectly wonderful books set in China, has switched gears to London and crafted this wonderful book called The Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne. And fortunately, she has signed copies for us, and we still have some available. So if you're enjoying the program and you want to support Elsa, not to mention the Poison Pen, we encourage you to order a copy before they run out, which is a fairly frequent hazard these days. We do sell out. Anyway, Elsa, I'm so pleased to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very pleased to be there, or at least in this virtual realm that's kind of there.
So we've been together for all of your books and enjoyed having you here at the store. What caused you to migrate from China to London?
Yes, so there is a direct connection because this book, The Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne, is set in London in the early 18th century, as my other books were. But it began with my first book, Jade Dragon Mountain, which I wrote during the time that I spent in southwest China, in the city that rests at the foot of the real Jade Dragon Mountain. And that book is about an exiled librarian named Li Du who solves the murder of a Jesuit traveler. But really something I didn't know before I started writing books is that by the time you've finished one, you've created a lot of ghosts. These ghosts of characters really who didn't end up finding a place in the story, and ghosts of plot points that had to be deleted. So The Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne started with one of those ghosts. In Jade Dragon Mountain, I had planned on a character who was going to be modeled after a man named James Cunningham. And James Cunningham was a Scottish ship surgeon who journeyed to China in 1696. And when he announced that he was going to do it, it was this huge deal because there were very few Westerners going to China at that point. And he was asked by a London apothecary to bring back as many plants as he could, and he was given instructions for how to preserve these plants and bring them back to England. And so that character inspired by Cunningham didn't really end up in Jade Dragon Mountain, but I'd done all this research on these collectors who were waiting in England for things like Cunningham's plants to arrive. And I always wanted to follow those boxes of pressed plants back from China to England and enter that community of the collectors. So for my 4th book, Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne, that is what I decided to do.
You know, that's so interesting. I don't know how many people realize that the mutiny on the Bounty, the Bounty was actually on an expedition to bring back, I think it's the breadfruit tree, although I might have the tree wrong. But in any case, when the mutiny happened and Captain Bligh was put overboard in his little boat and sailed, I think, something like 2,000 miles, in order to survive, he took the plants with him, possibly the breadfruit tree, I think it was the breadfruit tree. And the idea was to bring them back, I think, to Kew Garden in the same way that in the 19th century, the British sent a secret agent up the Amazon to Manaus in order to gain some rubber tree pods and bring them back to Kew Garden. So the British had a history of not only collecting, but actually plundering plants from other parts of the world with the thought that they could gain economic benefit by bringing them back to England, right?
Exactly, and with that comes in the real world context and history of this collection carries a heavy legacy of exploitation and cruelty. A lot of these ships that were carrying the plants back were the same ships that were transporting enslaved people, and a lot of this travel was a big part of Britain's colonial agenda. So that's a legacy that some of the collections, which still, the objects still exist, and the institutions that display them definitely have to incorporate the full context of the story there.
I love your comment about ghosts. I mean, now it all makes much more sense to me. The other thing, I'm going to admit Doug now, who is joining us, but the other thing I would say that I thought so interesting about Jade Dragon Mountain was that it was a technology coming to a very rural part of China that caused part of the plot to work. And you know, I think that's fascinating because we don't necessarily think of that as something that might happen in the 18th century, but in fact it was European technology that caused the disruption. So here comes Doug, and we're going to talk about Cabinets of Curiosity in a moment, as soon as he signs in from rural Maine.
Hi.
Hello, Douglas.
How are you?
We are great. So here's my opportunity to introduce the two of you. Elsa, this is Doug, and Douglas, this is Elsa.
Hi, it's very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, you too. I'm really enjoying reading your book. It's absolutely fabulous. I love it.
Thank you.
So Doug, one of the reasons I asked you to join us was to talk about Cabinets of Curiosity and what they are. And Elsa has some great points. I'm losing my voice for some reason. I'm going to go get something to drink for a minute. Elsa had some great points that she wanted to bring up about why people collect and what happens to collections and all like that. So Elsa, do you want to take over and talk to Doug about it?
Sure. We were talking a little bit about these very early collections that were happening in England. These collectors who were amassing objects with the idea, it seemed to me as I was doing research into it, with the idea of almost arranging the entire world on their shelves and kind of claiming control of it, claiming understanding of it by sort of collecting one of everything and making almost a Garden of Eden in these London townhouses, and the idea of the collections. The connection between the collections and the collectors making them was, I think, really what inspired my story. I don't know what's drawn you to collections and your own experience with museums.
Well, that's fascinating. So you must have done a lot of research in the history of Cabinets of Curiosities.
I did. I found my way there in a sort of roundabout way because it started with my earlier books, which were set in China and were following more the adventures of travelers there, and I had always wanted to follow the sort of crates that they were sending back to England and see what happened in the community of people, you know, waiting to open them up and see these pressed plants and various objects. So to write Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne, I had to learn a lot. I didn't come to it with a lot of background knowledge in the time. But it was great to find so many amazing primary sources. These collectors were so obsessed with what they were doing that they made these detailed catalogs of writing down and organizing everything that they had, and you can find them online. So just kind of pick things from them to put into a story.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, you certainly made very good use of the whole atmosphere of the Cabinet of Curiosities in your novel. It's so wonderfully atmospheric, and it captures London so well at that time. I mean, it really is just a delightful read. So
when you say cabinet, would one of you like to define what a cabinet was? Because, you know, I'm not sure that our modern idea of a cabinet, like a kitchen cabinet, is really what we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, it was more of it was much bigger than you would think of it as a normal cabinet. It was a collection, often very eclectic, of many strange and wonderful objects that have been found all over the world. And as Elsa was saying, some of these British eccentrics, you know, who had a lot of money, instead of doing the grand tour and going around Italy and collecting Renaissance art and marble busts, they would go all over the world and collect weird bones and fossils and gemstones and you know, fish in jars. I like that scene where the fellow steps on the dead fish. That's good. Your writing is, you have a wonderful sense of humor in your writing. I love it. But wit, very witty. But anyway, So these were just really interesting uh, collections. They were often filled rooms of a grand house. So they were much more than just a cabinet.
And the idea that it was really the time, at least in the late 1600s and early 1700s, when Cabinets of Barnaby Mayne is set, was before the idea of museums as public, accessible institutions, at least in England. So the collections were this private realm, but really on the brink of opening up to being something different and more accessible and more part of a national project. And I was really drawn. I'm always drawn to the periods in history that feel like in between times, or like they're on the brink of something.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read the series by Patrick O'Brien, the Master and Commander, and then it's a whole series of books after that. Because the one of the characters, one of the main characters in that series of novels is an avid, obsessed collector of weird things, and he sails all over the world on this ship with the main character and has many adventures, but meanwhile he's collecting all this wonderful stuff.
Well, and then it's very, one can't resist wanting to set a mystery story in a Cabinet of Curiosities, because it's also just so creepy. And I really enjoyed over the past few days reading your book, Cabinet of Curiosities, which just makes incredible use of how scary it is to find yourself in these labyrinthine halls, or going down and down into darker and darker places with, dragonfly wings blowing at you from inside jars. I mean, as a mystery writer, you just can't resist that.
It's true. It really makes the perfect setting for a mystery, and it's kind of surprising that more writers haven't used it. But it is interesting. The cabinets were the precursors to the museums, and in fact, many great museums, like at Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum, started out as a cabinet, and even I worked at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which is like the biggest cabinet of curiosities in the world, and many of those collections originally came from cabinets. So it was kind of that's where I got the idea for the Cabinet of Curiosities. The novel that we wrote was my time working at the museum, where 93% of their collections are not on display. They're squirreled away in rooms. I mean, just unbelievable acres and acres of storage rooms filled with everything you can imagine. I mean, 20,000 rats in jars of alcohol. And then they have giant vats containing entire giraffes and rhinoceroses in alcohol, preserved, whole, absolutely incredible. And gorillas, and it's just amazing what they have at the museum. They've got rooms full of blue whale skeletons that are 100 feet long, hanging. The skeletons are so heavy that they can't be put on the floor, because the weight of the skeletons will deform them and break them. So they're hanging, in chains from the ceiling, and all this, stuff makes for the most amazing settings. And of course, Lincoln and I, we wrote this novel together. The Cabinet of Curiosities made very good use of those settings, and so have you in your grand London mansion, which is absolutely fabulous. I love the descriptions of it. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you. And as I said, and as you clearly experienced too, it's just irresistible. And to think of the quantity that was being collected, and at a time when moving things like that, I just don't. I read at one point in my research an account of a man who was working kind of secretarial duties for a collector named Hans Sloane, who was this very he collected for a long time. Sort of started his collection in the 1680s, and I think by the time he died in 1750, had over 70,000 items in his collection. And at one point, Hans Sloane retired from his townhouse in London to his house in Chelsea, and there's this journal entry by his poor servant describing what it was like to try to move this collection of 70,000 items in carriages with highway robberies, from the center of London to Chelsea, and getting to the house and trying to get all the books up by literally throwing them up to somebody in the windows from wheelbarrows. And it sounded exhausting, but somehow was done. And then actually Hans Sloane's collection, when he died, he left it to British Parliament, and it became kind of the foundation of the British Museum. So it's still very much a part of that history.
Well, that's fantastic. I know at the American Museum, I learned that Alfred Kinsey, am I remembering the name right? Alfred Kinsey, who was the sex researcher. Before he became a sex researcher, he was an entomologist, and he studied gall wasps. And the museum had a collection of millions of gall wasp nests that he collected. And you've seen these, if you're in an oak forest, you see a little round, hollow, brown ball, a crispy little ball that is sort of lying on the ground. That's where a gall wasp developed, and that's what he collected. He had millions of those, and I often thought, what is the mentality of a person who would spend 20 years in the woods collecting all these little round balls? What was he trying to figure out? I mean, do you have any insight into what moves people to become obsessed collectors?
It's such a good question. I've been thinking about it so much too. It seems that there are some different reasons, and the one that hooked me in sort of character design was not a very good answer to your question, which seems more an intellectual curiosity and drive that's so specific to a certain thing. But what I saw a lot of was a sense of legacy and a sense of and this is a theme that comes up in your Cabinet of Curiosities in your novel as well, of immortality. This idea that if you collect and you make all these choices, both what you collect and how you label it, how you arrange it, you're kind of encoding yourself in that collection, and so that the collector lives on. And it seemed to me in researching these early collectors that they were really aware of that, and there was this determination to protect their collections after they died. So a lot of the ones with smaller collections would try to convince their friends with larger collections to promise to absorb the smaller ones if the one died first, and protect it and carry it forward as the legacy of that collector. So there's that. But what are your thoughts on the more specific intellectual fascinations that can just drive a person's entire life?
Well, it's curious. I mean, I'm thinking of your character, Barnaby Mayne, who did not live very long to enjoy his collections. But I don't know. I think there's something almost, encoded in our genes that makes us want to amass things. And sometimes the amassing of things can become truly a mental illness, like a hoarder, with newspapers and books and junk and everything else. And sometimes the amassing of things can be another kind of mental illness, which is the amassing of billions of dollars. That people are, making much more money than they could ever use, and going to great trouble to do it. But sometimes that amassing takes the place of an intellectual curiosity, and that's a much more, I would say, a much more healthy direction for this kind of genetic thing about wanting to accumulate stuff.
It's such a good point, though, the deep humanness. I mean, from what person can walk down a beach and not pick up sea glass and take it back to your bed and breakfast or cottage and arrange it by color on the table. I mean, it's just it is so human.
I know. I have all kinds of collections of things that I found and collected, and I'm looking around my little office here and at home, and I'm thinking, oh my God, when I die, my poor children, what are they going to do? I mean, most of this stuff doesn't have any value. It's worthless, but it's, you know, I love it, but they're going to probably just have to throw it away. I don't know.
Do you
But
know?
I found wonderful things, and I have to tell you, yesterday I took my boat out to an island with some kids, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law and their kids. We went out to this island, and we anchored off the island. We swam in, and there on the beach, right there, was a gigantic Indian spear point.
Wow.
And I picked it up, and it had been sort of gently tumbled by the ocean. So if I just added one more thing to my useless and burgeoning collection.
I think it was waiting.
So
It's so. Sorry, go ahead.
Before you joined us, Doug, we had a brief conversation about, in some cases, the economics, particularly of the British, who have often been called a nation of shopkeepers, you know, that they were so interested in trade, and they would go, particularly with plants, you know, try to collect rubber tree pods or other things in order for there to be economic gain. But I was interested today in reading, I don't remember if it was the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, there was a big article about an exhibit that the Metropolitan Museum in New York has opened to celebrate its 150th anniversary. And a lot of the article had to do with the different missions of a museum, how they evolve, how they change, you know, what their origins when somebody gave them something. But what kind of emphasis do they put on that today, and where do they look to collect that is more inclusive, more representative? You know, how, in other words, museums have acquired missions, which is sort of what you're talking about with individuals. You know, but those were self-ascribed missions, right? Whether it was just to decorate their English country house or spend their money or create immortality, whatever. But modern museums are now subject to, you know, boards and curators and basically changes in societal ideas of what a museum ought to present. It's really fascinating to look over the evolution of these institutions.
Yeah, it certainly is. I know at the American Museum of Natural History, where I used to work, there were, you know, all kinds of debates about what was appropriate to show and what wasn't. And, you know, the one thing about our museum was that they never could throw anything out. They even had collections of marijuana that had been collected in the 19th century in Africa, and they couldn't throw that out, even though it was illegal to own it. But what you can put on display has changed. For example, the museum used to put human remains on display. They had the famous Copper Man, which was that mummy found in a copper mine in Chile. It's 5,000 years old, and all these. They had thousands of mummies and all kinds of human remains that they had on display that they took off display because that was, you know, considered more recently to be disrespectful, terribly disrespectful to the societies that these people came from. So now it's all stuffed and locked up in storage rooms.
So let's talk for a moment about your two books, because they're an interesting contrast. You and Lincoln are writing a thriller with Agent Pendergast, and so part of the point of the collection was the serial killer trophy thing, which is part of being a serial killer. Whereas Elsa is writing a more classic detective story, and so Sir Barnaby Mayne's Cabinet of Curiosities is really his entire mansion. So in essence, Elsa, you're really writing kind of Agatha Christie country house mystery, where all of the suspects, actually Rex Stout even wrote a Nero Wolfe like that, where all the suspects were people who were in a banquet room. And when somebody died, only the people in the banquet room or the servers were the eligible suspects. So you've got this man with his whole London mansion, and he's giving tours. So it's almost like a museum with people passing through, except they have to have appointments. And when he dies, you've got that same situation, that only the people basically in the mansion on tour or working for him are the reasonable suspects. So did you pick that form, you know, particularly for writing your book? Did you want to write a classic detective story?
I did. It's a form I've loved ever since being a very early reader. I mean, it maybe started with Cam Jansen, Nancy Drew, Agatha Christie. I recently found in a cassette tapes that we had from a move my parents had done, a audiobook recording that I had done at age 9, reading out loud The 13 Problems by Agatha Christie, in which the entire time I pronounce Colonel Bantry, Colonel Bantry, because that's the way it looked. So I just love imposing that order and that formula of a classic fair play whodunit on human motivations and evil. I like that it almost feels like at its core it's a math or a logic problem, and then you overlay just as much believable humanity as you can, and that challenge just draws me back again and again. And I enjoyed moving it to an actual English manor house for this one. And the idea to set it in a tour of the collection, though, that came a little bit from historical research, because I was reading the journal of a Swedish scientist named Per Kalm, who visited the collection of Hans Sloane and went on a tour like this. Sloane would give these private tours of his collection that were quite exclusive. And the journal that Peter Kalm wrote after the day just showed that he was so overwhelmed and overstimulated by what he'd seen, that it was just room after room of skeletons and jars and creatures and jewels and plants and objects he didn't recognize, that his mind was just a jumble. And it just occurred to me that if you have a whole group of people going through that and you have a murder occur, it's going to be a situation where people are sort of uniquely a little bit less able to remember what happened when and where they were, because it's this constant overstimulation, and that seemed kind of like something a murderer might be able to work with. So I was drawn to that.
That's very clever. It's very cool. I love the atmosphere that you create, but also your characters are very interesting. I mean, your Sir Barnaby Mayne is quite a character, and then the detective, or the kind of the Cecily. Am I pronouncing that right? Cecily?
Or Cecily.
Cecily. Okay. She's a fabulous character, and I wonder, is she gonna become a series character? Or are you gonna keep
I hope so. That's what I'm working on now. Is another adventure for her and for her. I don't know if I give it away to say exactly what their relationship is, but her friend Mackin. So I am working on another one, and it took me a long time to find her as a protagonist. I struggled a little bit, but then once I did, I really like spending time with her. She is a 18th century plant enthusiast that is modeled on a couple of historical figures, women who at the time were able to kind of establish themselves in this collecting and scientific community, even as early as the early 1700s.
Yeah, well, she is really a fabulous character, so I'm glad to hear that. I'm looking forward to reading more books in the series, so you're going to have to write fast.
So do either of you know a series by Deanna Rayburn, which is set in the under Victoria, and her protagonist, her detective, is a woman lepidopterist, but she is a woman who collects butterflies for people who have collections. So, Elsa, if you don't know them, it's really very interesting. And one of the few things that a woman could sort of respectably do, because you couldn't really have a job if you were an upper class English woman, but you could do something like go out and collect whatever it might have been, in her case, butterflies, but there are other examples of women who collected other things and could make a living by selling those things, which I think is fascinating. So there are a lot of forces at work, I think, in helping, generate collections of the natural world. Not art necessarily, but things from the natural world that have led us to modern museums. But a question that Elsa has raised, and Doug, it's something you probably have had to think about too, is this huge question of what happens to a collection when the collector either dies or ages out for some reason or goes broke and, can't maintain it. Because there's a lot of expense connected with maintaining a collection. So a lot of museum politics come in. What's your experience, Doug, with how that works?
Well, my experience, at least in looking at the history of the museum, was that a lot of those people gave their collections to the museum. And the museum, if they were a good collection that would have very good provenance, where very careful notes have been taken, and each specimen had been carefully preserved and so forth, the museum would love to get them. Now, there was a problem, though, at the American Museum in that there were a lot of rich patrons of the museum who were also big game hunters in the 19th century, and they'd go off and they'd kill water buffalo and elephants and leopards and lions and rare animals, and then they wanted to give their trophy heads to the museum. Well, the museum didn't want these trophy heads. They were useless scientifically, but you can't say no if they're also giving you a lot of money. So when you went up to the mammalogy department, the walls of the hallway were covered with these horrible trophies. They're all got mange, the hair is falling out, they've been there for 100 years. But the museum, again, couldn't throw them out. They came from famous people like Theodore Roosevelt, others. And so the halls were lined with these dreadful trophies. I don't know if it's still that way, but when I worked there, it was. So that's one of the drawbacks is having to accept donations of collections from rich people in order to get their money.
Well, and really, today I think increasingly, if you want to donate something to an institution, it really has to come with an endowment, because it's a big expense for the institution to maintain the collection. And there certainly have been some controversy, like at the New York Public Library, where somebody, like, as you were suggesting, a rich patron has, let's say, given it a painting, and now the library would like to sell the painting in order to raise money for another purpose. And how does that work? So, Elsa, do you think that Sir Barnaby, was worried about what would happen to his collection?
Absolutely, and in some ways, it's almost the core of the story. He was very worried about it, and that came through in the research I was doing within this community of collectors. They were really focused on ensuring that their collections were taken care of after they were gone, and there was a lot of intrigue going on around that. I mean, feuds and betrayals, because as we were talking about a moment ago, maintaining a collection is extremely expensive. I mean, you need the space, you need to take care of the objects, prevent them from decaying, keeping them organized. And so a lot of these collectors would be like, I give you my collection, and the response was like, please no. So, and that comes through. I mean, they write about it, about these social dynamics of dealing with it. There was also intrigue around when collectors died and their collections passed into, in some cases, into the control of their widows. There was the question of what the widows would do, and in some cases they were terribly taken advantage of by sort of predatory collectors who wanted to break up the collection and take the pieces of it that they wanted. In other cases, the widows were able to turn it to their advantage and sell parts of the collections in a controlled way and make some money, or devote themselves to it themselves and indulge their own interests and obsessions. So that's another side of the story where you see some of the roles that women were playing at the time.
There's another factor that comes in that I have seen in my own family. There's a collection at the Library of Congress generated by my husband's grandfather, and it is referred to as a closed collection. In other words, when he died, then that ended the collection, the collecting part of it. And I thought that was a really interesting point, which is, to maintain the integrity and personality of the collector, would an institution or another person close the collection, or would that person feel free to add things to the collection? I think that's a really, really tricky question that hadn't occurred to me until came up one day when I was at the library. So, Doug, have you run into that, or have you thought about that?
Well, it's an interesting idea. When you close a collection like that, what you're doing is you're sort of honoring the vision of the person who put those objects together, and you don't want that to be disrupted or disturbed by the adding of new objects. That kind of dilutes the whole vision of the person. So your husband's grandfather must have really been a very interesting collector. He must have had a certain vision for what he wanted to do, and the Library of Congress closed the collection in order to preserve that as this kind of historical monument to that particular collector. But I'm curious, what was the collection?
It's the library's largest collection of rare books, incunabula, William Blake, and so forth. And there's actually a Rosenwald librarian, which is a paid position within the Library of Congress that operates the collection. I only brought it up because it had never occurred to me, and it's something that hovers in Elsa's book, is that without Sir Barnaby, then the collection ended with him, so to speak, or at least his vision for it. And then what would happen if somebody takes it over? I'd never given it any thought until that arose one day while I was at the library on tour. But I've thought about it a lot since, and you're right, that the personality, the ethics, the interests, all of those things of an individual putting together something would be diluted if that collection were not closed. So, Elsa, does that, something you thought about with Sir Barnaby's collection?
It is, absolutely, and I go back so fundamentally in most of my writing to fairy tales, and when I was reading about it, it just kept making me think of, in fairy tales, the way a sorcerer will, hide his soul inside some secret, and turn it into a needle and put it in an egg inside a badger, inside a bear, or something. Like the ways that you hide yourself in something external to yourself, and that just made me think of sorcerers and magicians and magic, which really found its way into the inspiration for the book, because another big part of it was that at this time and in this community of collectors, there was a lot of interest in the occult, and a lot of the collections were connected to occult studies. So that was something that lent itself to that atmosphere.
Bill, do we have any questions?
Yeah. Was the research in person or other resources? If in person, how was it accomplished?
Did you hear that? Was your research in person, or was it largely from sources? And how did you accomplish it either way?
Good question for me?
Yep.
A little bit of both. Some of it was in person. I traveled to London for, I wish it could have been longer, but just about 10 days, and spent a lot of time in the British Museum. But one of the main things I was trying to do was to find a model for the house in which the book is set, because everything takes place in that very closed way. I wanted to be able to walk around in a house, and I actually was able to find a model in Samuel Johnson's house, which you're allowed to visit, and it's a townhouse in London. So I was able to walk around and stand on the staircase and take notes about which rooms I could hear conversation from other visitors clearly from, and where the light was falling when, and whether I could hear footsteps on the stairs and from how many landings away. And that was hugely valuable, in addition to just visiting the British Museum and looking at these objects on display there from collections of the time. So that was the in-person research, and then supplemented with a lot of research with secondary and primary sources at home.
Great.
So are you a fan of Dr. Johnson?
I didn't know very much about him before going to this house, but now I'd like to know more. It was wonderful. What about you?
Oh, I'm a huge fan of his. I love his work. And Boswell's Life of Johnson is a fabulous book.
Probably
There's that.
Yeah. probably the definitive biography, if you really think about it. I think it's often cited that Boswell's Life of Johnson is like, the acme of biographies. Amazing book. Do you have another question?
Sure, it's from our friend Karen Auden. Here's the question I always love to ask. What were your favorite books as a child, and would you say any of them extend their influence over you still, whether in genre, or time period, or tone?
It's a wonderful question, and I guess I've already mentioned the mystery component in Ken Jansen and Nancy Drew. Another big favorite for me as a child were the My Father's Dragon books, and I'm not remembering the author, but they should be almost within sight. But these books about a little boy who gets is put on a quest by a cat to go save a dragon on an island, and it involves packing the perfect backpack with everything he could possibly need in it. So I would say that did influence my trajectory as a writer, because my books, I'm just such a control freak with my books. It's why I like mysteries, and the idea of lists and packing things and everything being just perfect and laid out has kind of been with me, in addition to magic and fairy tales and saving baby dragons when possible.
What about you, Doug?
Oh, let's see. I don't know. Hardy Boys, of course. I think that you read Nancy Drew, and that led you to this type of mystery that you write, and I read the Hardy Boys, and I'm writing books like Cabinet of Curiosities, which are more thrillers. But I don't know. I had two books that I loved as a child: The Curious Lobster and The Curious Lobster's Island, and I can't remember who wrote them, but they were sort of about the adventures of this lobster who lived under the sea, and this ugly sculpin that nobody liked because he was ugly, but he was very nice and funny, and various other animals that had adventures. I don't know how that connects to my writing, but there it is.
Another question, Bill?
At the time or times of your books, how did people find out about collections and share information about them? How would the Swedish researcher, for instance, learn about Sloane's collection?
It's also a really fun question. I think the collecting community relied so much on correspondence, because it was about conveying items from all over the world into people's collections. So Hans Sloane, I know, as a very powerful collector, had agents in various cities throughout Europe who were working for him. So they would be able to write to him if there was going to be an auction of the collection of some other foreign collector. And so he could send Sloane a list of everything that was going to be up, and Sloane would be able to circle what he wanted bid on and send it back. So that would be an example of there being this constant written correspondence between people who were interested in collecting or interested in the scientific research that was starting to be based around and relying on these collections. So between word of mouth and sort of tight community within London, it was also this prolific international correspondence.
Elsa, did people hire in the same way that families may have hired someone to maintain their muniment rooms? Did people hire a cataloger or administrator or curator for their collections?
Yes, absolutely. There would have been, Sloane had, I believe his name was William Sherrard, I might be getting that wrong, but a series of different curators or stewards who would, depending on which individual it was, also be administering to other matters having to do with the estate, but sometimes really just focused on the collection, keeping it organized, devising and maintaining a labeling system. So those would have been coveted jobs, perhaps by people within the collecting community who maybe weren't affluent enough to be collectors themselves, might be working for collectors in that capacity. And there's so the character in Cabinets, Walter Dinley, is modeled on Sloane's, a figure who would have served that role for Hans Sloane.
But didn't they also produce catalogs, and those catalogs could then be exchanged, or things would go up for auction, and collectors would peruse the auction catalogs and make bids for them? I mean, it was an early version of Sotheby's or Christie's, right? In fact, I'm not sure Sotheby's and Christie's didn't actually start in the 18th century, although I can't swear that. Do you know, Doug, what did they do?
No, I don't. That's a really good question.
Well, we can look it up. Another question over there, Bill?
With the book set in London, did you visit or can you do online research, and does COVID affect research?
So yes, I was lucky enough to be able to visit London and do the research there, finding the model for a house and going to various museums. That was more than a year ago now, so the question of COVID hadn't yet arisen. Certainly I wouldn't be able to be traveling now and can't for researching my next book, but there is a wealth of information online. I mean, through the philosophical transactions, which were a journal of the Royal Society, are all available online. And the Biodiversity Heritage Library is another place that has a huge amount of digitized manuscripts from the time period by collectors and botanists and other scientists. So I have no excuse to stop working just because I can't travel.
Any else? Sotheby's was founded in 1744, according to Bill, who looked it up on his handy phone. So, in point of fact, Sir Barnaby, what are we in? 1703 was Sir Barnaby? Right.
Mm-hmm.
But so not too long afterward, then collectors could, in fact, really, have professional auctions and auction catalogs available. So, in the same way that when we started the bookstore 31 years ago, we used to send out catalogs every month. We mailed them out, people would fill them in, send checks, back they would come. I mean, it's almost impossible to think of that right now, right, in a digital age, but it wasn't that long ago. All right, is that it?
There's a couple more. Can each author take one character from their book and give a name and thumbnail description as to why you like or dislike them?
Ooh. All right, Doug, we need a thumbnail description of a character that you either like or dislike that appears in the Pendergast.
All right. Well, let's see. I'm going to pick the character Corey Swanson, who started off in one of the early Pendergast books as a high school student, who was kind of a rebel. She was growing up in a small Midwestern town, and she was loved reading, but she was a rebel. She dyed her hair purple. She was kind of a goth type, and very much rejected by her classmates and teased and so forth. And she has gone through a great deal of transformation, and she has recently graduated from the academy and is now a new rookie FBI agent.
Wonderful, and she appears in a book we'll talk about in just a minute. Elsa, you could count in your 3 Chinese books as well as Sir Barnaby, is there an outstanding character?
Oh, that makes it even harder if I get to open up to all of them. I'll restrain myself to to Cabinets and say, because I haven't really talked about her yet, Mackin Barlow, who is a childhood friend of my detective and protagonist, but they haven't seen each other in many years. She's the daughter of a gardener who has been widowed and is making her way, earning money within this community by doing botanical illustrations. And I like her very much for 2 main reasons. One, that she is a little bit more irreverent and cynical than Cecily, my detective. Cecily's very focused on truth. Mackin is more aware that things can be more complicated and more human most of the time, and I like that about her. I learn from her in her having those opinions. And I also like her because she was inspired by a conversation that I had with a very dear friend. So when I'm writing scenes with her, I kind of feel like my friend Anna is hanging out with me, which I enjoy.
We have another one from Karen Auden. It says, also for Elsa especially, there have been quite a few recent books drawing on botany as a theme. Amy Stewart's The Drunken Botanist, Hope Jaren's Lab Girl, Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer, and Powers' Overstory. Do you think there's something going on in our culture that is encouraging writers, including yourselves, to draw upon the plant world for inspiration or tropes?
I hope so. I think I like the idea of that being, and there being an undercurrent of return to and enhanced respect for plants and focus on plants and the incredible complexity of them and importance of conserving them. So yes, I mean, those books. There was also Elizabeth Gilbert's Signature of All Things was another really great one, and yeah, Overstory, I think you mentioned. I'm as part of that trend, I'm a little bit. I had the biased avenue into it, in that I'm married to a botanist. so there are a lot of plants in my life, no matter what, all the time. And you know, I live less than half a block from the botanical garden, so it's very much a part of my life. But I love the idea of it being part of the lives of many writers and readers, and increasingly so.
That was a wonderful question. So Elsa, you have told us about you're working on another book with Cecily in London. Doug, give us a small preview, if you will. We have you appearing here with Lincoln on January 12th. I can already say that. Isn't that exciting? Tuesday, January 12th, with a new book called The Scorpion's Tale. You want to give us just a little preview of that?
Well, sure. It involves the character I just mentioned, Corey Swanson, who has just been assigned to the Albuquerque FBI office, and she's given kind of not a very interesting case. In a ghost town in the Jornada del Muerto desert of New Mexico, they found a body. It's probably about 75 years old, and it's partially mummified. And she's sent down there to figure out, was this a homicide or an accidental death, or what? It's on federal land, so that's why the FBI is involved. And so she goes down there and she looks at it and she says, "Boy, this body is falling apart. It's as fragile as you know. It's just like a dry leaf, you know." So she calls in an archaeologist named Nora Kelly that she worked with on a previous case to excavate the body to figure out, was this person murdered, or what happened to this person, and who was it? And of course, as Nora's excavating the body, they make quite a disturbing, horrific discovery, and that's sort of how the novel was launched.
Wow, we can't get away from mummies and things people collect. I love it. So, be sure that you mark down January 12th on your calendar, because it'll be really fun. And the first book with Nora Kelly and Corey together is called Old Bones. They came out a year ago at this time, right, Doug?
That's right.
Yep, so very exciting. Well, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us this afternoon. It's been a wonderful discussion. And I want to thank those of you who joined us on Facebook. Please, again, we have autographed copies of Elsa's wonderful book. And we'll hope that you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.